Who are these people?
Whatever. But
Yeah.
in other terrible news,
Which also relates.
yes, there's military in the schools. I don't know if people knew. It's been happening for a while. I find it interesting that the New York Times is picking it up. That they've been grooming our children. So, but Caitlin Johnstone writes that military. Go ahead.
Not all children.
No, not all children. Military groomers are increasingly infiltrating U.S. high schools. This is Caitlin Johnstone, of course. People should go check out her Substack. Links are in the description below, as always. So, Caitlin writes, a New York Times report has found that enrollment in the Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps, a Pentagon-funded program designed to groom children for military service, is increasingly becoming mandatory in U.S. high schools.
Pause right there. Again,
yes,
this is where a lot of this money is also going to.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Becoming mandatory.
Right.
Okay.
Not elective.
So, I also wanted to say, I grew up in a very rural area, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both like low income rural areas are where these programs shine because they want their kids to have somewhere to go, and this will get them there a lot better. They end up in officers programs and things like that. So JROTC programs taught by military veterans at some 3,500 high schools across the country are supposed to be elective. And the Pentagon has said that requiring students to take them goes against its guidelines. The report says, but the New York Times found that thousands of public school students were being funneled into the classes without ever having chosen them, either as an explicit requirement or by being automatically enrolled. While Pentagon officials have long insisted that JROTC is not a recruiting tool, sorry, what? Like, really, Pentagon? How do you insist on something so wrong? That's the thing. Like, eventually you got to be like, okay,
Yeah.
Anyway, they have openly discussed expanding the $400 million a year program, whose size has already tripled since the 1970s, as a way of drawing more young people into military service. How the fuck? Then that is not a fucking recruiting tool, Pentagon. How? You just said, the Army says 44% of all soldiers who entered its ranks in recent years came from a school that offered JROTC, the Times reports. So, yeah. There it is. In high schools across the U.S., thousands of students are being placed in the military's JROTC classes without choosing them on their own. The only word I can think of is indoctrination, one parent said. I mean, yes. Welcome to the U.S. school system.
Right.
Like, and before you ask, no. The Pentagon's grooming program is not being forced on kids in Malibu and the Hamptons, says Caitlin.
Exactly. And keep reading. I saw the last part. Keep reading the last paragraph, and then I have thoughts about it.
A vast majority of the schools were those high enrollment numbers were attended by a large population of non-white students and those from low-income households, the Times reported, naming Detroit, LA, Philadelphia, Oklahoma City, and Mobile, Alabama, as cities where high schools are funneling kids into the program en masse.
I mean, it's not surprising, but obviously, if you are in a private school or if you happen to live in an affluent area where you have to go to a public school, you don't have to worry about this. This is meant for the low income class in rural areas and in cities.
Yep.
Where, as you said, Reef, and you lived in a rural area. I lived in a low income, high poverty area in New Jersey. So like, I went to private school, so I avoided most of this. But I know, like, with my other peers who went to public school, like an option, for like, and funny enough, my mom asked me one time if I wanted to consider, going into the Marines or whatever, and I said, fuck no. And that was the first only time she ever had to ask me. Because my older siblings said to me from young, do not go fight in a white man's war. Their words. That's not even my parents.
Famously, Ali had to go through an entire process. Like, back when he was what? He wasn't even Ali then. That was Cassius Clay. During the Nam War, like, and he called out that shit then. So, but defenders of the mandatory JROTC enrollment reportedly cite the need to divert students away from drugs or violence, and the allure of drugs and gangs in urban areas, as though corralling them into the single most violent gang on earth is deterrent from violence and gangs. Also not a deterrent from drugs. Ask those Desert Storm guys. They found opium. Like, they were perfectly happy there. Nam guys found weed. Like, smoking it out of shotguns. Like, anyway. Grooming students to go kill foreigners for crude oil is not my idea of a healthy diversion from youthful error, but maybe that's just me. And I think it goes more than that. This is not just like, people don't know what those like classes do. They force those kids to go in uniform to school multiple times a week, and like that then indoctrinates the rest of the kids. Right. Like,
actually, those of you in the chat who are younger than me, which is some of you, let me know if, like, especially if you're male, like, if you were 18, if you had anything, if you had to make sure that you're in selective service, like, if that was, because I remember that was a thing.
Yep, still is.
When I was, it still is. Okay, but I remember that being a thing, for me, like, when I was in high school, like, and to the point where my school was like, make sure you sign up, even though, like, I went to a private school. None one of us were going to go into the military at all. Like, I think.
Yes, but you have to, because the draft still exists technically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
We have to go do that. Like, you burn that card, that's a federal, like.
But you know what? It's funny. They can do that automatically, but don't give you the right
voting
to
card.
vote.
Yeah. Yes.
Automatically.
It would probably be a good time to remind readers that poverty in the United States is one of the Pentagon's most effective recruiting tools, with Army officials explicitly acknowledging that young people's inability to afford a college education on their own is responsible for their success in meeting recruitment goals, and U.S. lawmakers warning that helping people pay off crushing student debt will hurt recruitment. U.S. military recruiters have an established record of targeting poor schools because impoverished communities often see military service as their only chance at upward mobility. So because now war is uncool with Gen Z, they're going to be like, oh, so we're going to force you to do it. Well, and recently, me and you remember that U.S. lawmakers say student loan forgiveness will hurt military recruiting. We definitely remember covering that. So, I mean, the New York Times describes a cult-like environment in these JROTC programs where parents in some cities say their children are being forced to put on military uniforms, obey a chain of command, and recite patriotic declarations in classes they never wanted to take, with special textbooks which at times falsify or downplay the failings of the U.S. government. And if even the New York Times believes you're falsifying and downplaying the failings of the U.S. government, it's got to be pretty bad. So every day I see US conservatives mindlessly bleating about groomers in the LGBT community, trying to turn children into sexual deviants, claiming kids are being indoctrinated in school by learning about gay marriage and respect for trans people, but none of them seem to have any problem with the real life indoctrination and grooming kids are subjected to by the most murderous and depraved institution in the world. One of the dumbest things happening in mainstream Western political discourse right now is the way conservatives are increasingly framing themselves as society's last bulwark against the normalization of child molestation, something which has been growing reliably less normalized and more aggressively rejected across the entire political spectrum for generations. But sure, pretend the ideology which wants to drag civilizations back to the days of Boy Scouts, the Catholic Church, and fathers reigning supreme over their household and everyone in it, are the ones protecting us from the rape of children. The most consequential groomers of our day are not LGBT people and their allies, but the adults who are grooming children to violently enact the will of the most tyrannical regime on earth, with the full support of their government, and yet so far, it's been mostly conservatives who have seen defending the news of mandatory JROTC enrollment in impoverished neighborhoods. They're not just fine with this kind of indoctrination, they actively support it. And to them, Caitlin can only say, okay, groomer. Caitlin with shots fired. Shots fired from Caitlin. You know? So, I don't know. Yeah.
Jamon in the chat said, I'm going to be honest, it's good exercise. Yeah, it's good exercise if you want it.
Yes, so is band, so is football,
right.
So is baseball, so is every other extracurricular.
Right.
Like,
but again, like growing up, like for me, this was done as an elective. Like, that was something that you chose to do, not something that is mandatory for you to do.
Right.
And again, like if it should be mandatory, why is it not offered at every school in the country?
Right.
You know, rich parents are not going to go for that.
Well, and this is,
places in some might, but like the majority will not because they don't want their babies, their trust fund babies. I want you to think.
Do you know what? One of the biggest supporters of our like military industrial complex, the APAC lobby. Do you know what their country does? They have mandatory enrollment in military service.
Right. Yeah.
So this is partially, I wonder if they're testing something like that. I know, I'm not sure if it was, the Jammin said, Israel has mandatory service. You know, I could see this being a source of propaganda and the U.S. using a similar system. Yeah. Yes. You know, I mean, this is, I don't want to make that like reference too close to Israel, but there was a particular youth group that was created in Germany, that the Boy Scouts were modeled after, technically. So yeah, it's just all marketing and terrible propaganda and
terrible propaganda and a way to ensure that they get
I find it
in when now it's kind of a lot harder to because and I think it again it's ironic that they're doing this with the people who are very more likely or willing to start a revolution in the country, that they're trying to cut them at the pass and being like, no, we're going to get you when you're in high school.
Yes.
Before you
and revert that revolutionary thing to put all that violence choosing in our pocket.
Right.
But an interesting that Caitlin, who a lot of people would say is too radical, horseshoed all the way over to the right wing, talking about the hypocrisy of the right wing here. Right. And they would probably call her anti-trans plenty of times and anti-LGBT. And here she is defending LGBT being taught in schools over the military industrial complex. And she says something, I think, what I want to get her words. One of the dumbest things happening in mainstream Western political discourse right now is the way conservatives are increasingly framing themselves as society's last bulwark against the normalization of child molestation. I mean, tomorrow we have a little special for Tara where we talked about a lot of that, where the right wing is allowed to be right.
Right.
We're giving them plenty of ammo to use.
Right.
Right. While also
So,
not taking care of the things we actually care about.
right.
It's this whole identity stuff, and they get to win this.
Right.
You
know, I mean, there are no
so
good actors here, but I think
no.
ultimately it just makes me very sad because I know, again, like growing up, for many people, even people like within my family, like they considered this an option because
Yeah.
they couldn't afford college any other way, or they wanted to get out of their, situation, especially if they're low income, or like whether they're in a rural area or in a city, and they saw no way out, and feeling like the military was the only way to go. But then it's just kind of like, again, I don't have a problem with necessarily people going in there, but you have to know what you're getting yourself into.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know Kit very recently, I think this week kind of talked about that in terms of like, feeling like, not to say he didn't have a choice, but I think he made a conscious effort to go into the military, like in college or whatever. So, um, but I wouldn't mind all of this if this was either a conscious choice, or if you're going to make it mandatory for everybody. But they're not going to do that because ultimately this is going to affect the elites who do not want their children to go off to war. So you can't have them going, because they're the ones who kind of run the companies of which are going to, you know, um, like they're going to be the ones who are going to ostracize these people who eventually might be the workers,
Mm-hmm.
in their company, so yeah, it sucks, but again, it just
Yep.
kind of like our theme. I think we didn't do this intentionally, but it just seems to be the theme of like how war is kind of connected, like I think for us kind of on a local level, in terms of like, for me, especially as a teacher, not a high school teacher, but something, having to maybe kind of in the rain or being kind of in the industry where I would have to kind of think about this, to more internationally where countries are going to be affected with potentially more war. That's going to affect us too.
Yeah.
But I think, our relationships with other countries abroad, I think are going to be put into question over the next few years. So,
Yep.
but as we kind of said, especially given Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last summer, we kind of suspected something is up. And given what we kind of reported tonight, it seems like the chess pieces are kind of set for more fuckery, down the road. So stay tuned.